Hi there, and welcome to the Inner West LGBTQ History Site Study. My name is Bess Davey. I'm a teacher and also a librarian, and I have had the pleasure of putting together this site study on behalf of the Inner West Council. This site study focuses on the history of the Inner West's LGBTQ community from roughly the 1970s until today. The Inner West local government area in Sydney is located on unceded Gadigal and Wangal land. I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal and Wangal peoples as the rightful owners and custodians of this land and pay my respects to elders past and present. I extend that respect to any First Nations people viewing this site study and acknowledge that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander sovereignty was never ceded. The image that you can see on this slide is an Aboriginal flag that was part of the 1996 Mardi Gras. That project to create the flag was led by Sue Pinkham, who grew up in the Inner West, and Louise Bell. You can read more about that project and that installation in the Historical Sources document, which makes up part of this site study. This site study has been designed to align with Stage 5 of the New South Wales History Syllabus, and it can link to either the old version of the syllabus published in 2012 or the new version published in 2024. It doesn't matter which one you're teaching, this site study is relevant to both versions. So all students in Stage 5 must complete one site study, which is a focused investigation of a site or area of historical significance, and that can either be a virtual site study such as this one or a physical visit to a site. There are 3 ways that you can link this site study into the content of the Stage 5 History Syllabus, and that's shown in the table here as number 1, 2 and 3. I'm going to talk about both versions of the syllabus simultaneously because for this content they're quite similar. There have been some changes, but not huge changes for this area. In other areas of the syllabus, of course, there have been bigger changes, but for this content, not so much. So the first link that you can make is via the historical context of the modern world or the modern world in Australia. And you can simply say a site study is mandatory, and this site study connects to that historical context of the modern world, and that can be the link that you use. If you want a more in-depth link, you can go to the core depth study, which is number 2, of rights and freedoms or human rights and freedoms, and you can link this site study into that content. In the new version of the syllabus, it specifically says that you need to study the struggle for rights and freedoms of one other group in Australia other than Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples or the US Civil Rights Movement, which are the 2 major topic areas covered in this core depth study. So the new history syllabus specifically says that you need to choose another Australian group, and the LGBTQ community could fit in there quite nicely if you choose that. And that could be a stronger link between your content and this site study. The third option is to develop a school-developed depth study based on the LGBTQ community of Australia. There are some options there for optional depth studies, including women in Australia, migration, and some other topics, or as a school you can develop your own topic. And this site study has got a lot of material in it, so you could actually use this site study as the basis of a school-developed depth study for history, if you choose to. You don't have to, but that's another way that this site study could be used. There's enough content here to really expand it out into a unit of work rather than it just being a site study, but that is up to you if you would like to use it that way. So those are the 3 major links to the content of the Stage 5 History Syllabus. If you would like to read more about how this site study touches on and connects to student outcomes, historical skills, and historical concepts for Stage 5, you can look at the document that is included as part of this site study called Teacher's Notes and Syllabus Links. In that document, you'll find a list of all of the outcomes, skills, and concepts that this site study covers, and it's most of them. So that's another way that you can link this site study into your teaching and into the content of the syllabus. One of the aims of site studies is to engage students in a process of historical inquiry. The old version of the syllabus states that a site study is an inquiry-based examination of an historically significant location, which enables students to understand their historical environment and participate actively in historical inquiry. So for the old version of the syllabus, historical inquiry is key to site studies. However, that version of the syllabus doesn't break down the process of historical inquiry into specific steps, whereas the new version of the syllabus does. So the 2024 version of the history syllabus breaks down the process of historical inquiry into these 3 steps here. I won't read through this because you can find all of this information in the document that I mentioned called Teacher's Notes and Syllabus Links. But there are basically 3 stages within historical inquiry. The first is acquiring historical information. The second is processing historical information. And the third is communicating historical information. The student activities that make up this site study are put together in a document called Guided Historical Inquiry. You can find that as part of this site study. So the Guided Historical Inquiry document is made up of activities that guide students through these 3 steps so that they can conduct their own mini historical inquiries. So I will talk more about that at the end of this presentation, but this site study has really been designed to get students to practice using the process of historical inquiry as it's outlined in the new version of the history syllabus. But that is relevant to the old version of the history syllabus as well. It's just more specifically broken down in the new version. So what is included in this site study kit? The first resource is this video, which is an introduction to the site study and its contents. The second resource is that document that I mentioned, the Teacher's Notes and Syllabus Links. In that document, you can find a brief historical overview of the history of the Inner West's LGBTQ+ community. You can also find detailed syllabus links and some recommendations for websites and also resources in the Inner West Library's collection that you could use to do further research. The third resource is a PowerPoint presentation that you can use to introduce this site study to your students. The fourth resource, which is the core of this site study, is the historical sources document. So in that document, you will find 57 historical sources with a brief description for each. But that document also includes lots of links to websites and to other resources. And the historical sources are a range of media. So you'll find photographs, recorded oral histories, videos, text-based historical sources, and more. There's a lot of different types of content in there. The next resource is the Guided Historical Inquiry document, which I also mentioned in the last slide. So this is the student activities for this site study. And as I mentioned, each of these activities is designed to guide the students through a step-by-step process of historical inquiry. The next resource is the extended bibliography of Inner West Library's collection items that are relevant to this site study. So in there you can find documentaries, books, ebooks, TV shows, and some of those resources are available digitally if you can't get to a physical library to pick up books and physical materials. Some of those items are digital. The inner west of Sydney, located on unceded Gadigal and Wongal land, is a significant site for Australia's LGBTQ+ history. Many of Australia's most prominent LGBTQ+ activists and collectives were based or are still based in the Inner West. So as an indication of this, in 2018, the Inner West Council installed 7 Pride seats, as you can see in the photos here, to commemorate Inner West activists and collectives that were significant to the area's LGBTQ+ history. You can read about all of these people and organisations in the historical sources document. So the numbers in brackets there are the numbers of the sources that you can find in that document to read more about each of these people or organisations. So this site study focuses on the period from the 1970s until today. And the reason for that is that the 1970s represented a turning point in both LGBTQ plus visibility but also activism in the inner west, in Australia more broadly, but also internationally after events like the Stonewall riots in New York City and some other milestones that were happening around the world. It was the start of a new wave of the gay liberation movement. So that's why this period has been selected for this site study. But it's important that we get students to think about what was happening on this site prior to the 1970s. So let's have a look at these two questions, which were designed to prompt discussion with your students. So the first one says, what do you think life was like for LGBTQ plus people living on this site, the Inner West, located on unceded Gadigal and Wangal land, in the period spanning from early colonisation up until the 1970s? So in the document Teachers' Notes and Syllabus Links, there's a historical overview in there that lists some references that discuss these periods before the 1970s. One of those articles talks about the fact that British colonies, such as Australia, imposed very harsh criminal punishment on non-heteronormative behaviours. And so it would be good to get your students to think about the effect of that on how historical evidence was recorded. So people living in the inner west in the period from early colonisation up until the 1970s, many of them were probably living in secrecy or in fear because they were worried about being criminally punished or persecuted. And so it would be good to get students to think about how that impacts our access to historical sources and evidence. Many of those people's stories were probably never recorded or may have been intentionally erased from historical records. And it's a good opportunity to get students to think about how social stigma affects the way that we archive and record history. Okay, the second question says, what about in the period before colonisation? Do you think ideas around gender and sexuality were different compared to the ideas imposed by European colonisers? So to explore that question a little bit more deeply, let's have a look at this extract from an essay titled The Question, or Who Asks for Evidence of Queerness in Aboriginal Culture, by Moody scholar Maddie Day. So it says, the colonial project of gender is only necessary precisely because Indigenous kinship and governance systems are incompatible with formations of colonial power like the patriarchal nuclear family. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander queer and transgender people do not need evidence that heterosexualism was introduced to our people and communities because we are embedded in living systems of knowledge and relations that affirm our existence. So this extract is included in the PowerPoint presentation that you can use with students, which is part of this site study kit. And you might want to ask students, what do you think the author means by this? You could have quite a good class discussion just based on this extract alone. And in the document Teachers' Notes and Syllabus Links, there are references to other articles by First Nation scholars who discuss this topic. So you can read more in that document as well. Okay, to continue, we are going to look at some of the historical sources that are included in the historical sources document. So there are 57 historical sources in total that look at the period from the 1970s until today. Roughly, I think there's a couple that are before that, but it's basically from the 1970s until today. And here is a selection of a few of them, but there are many more in that historical sources document. I'm not going to read all of these slides because there's quite a lot of text to give you that information so that you can convey that to students. But if you would like to read more, you can look at the PowerPoint presentation that has been designed to use with students, which is part of this kit, or you can look at that historical sources document. This historical source is an image, which is the front cover of a newsletter called Camp Inc. from 1971. And it shows a building which is 393 Darling Street in Balmain, where the clubhouse of a very important LGBTQ plus rights organisation was located on unceded Gadigal and Wangal land. So the organisation is also called Camp Inc. with a slightly different spelling, and they were a really key organisation who fought for legislative changes and also offered support services for LGBTQ plus people in the early 1970s. And you can read more about them in many of the historical sources. So down the bottom here it says sources 1 to 8, 12 and 14 to 18 in the historical sources document. You can read more about this very important organisation. This historical source shows the first ever male-to-male kiss that was aired on Australian TV between two of Australia's most prominent LGBTQ rights activists, Peter de Waal and Peter Bonsall Boone. They were a couple for over 50 years and they were involved in a lot of key legislative changes and advocating for marriage equality and advocating for lots of different campaigns for LGBTQ rights in Australia. And here they're pictured on an episode of the TV program Checkerboard from 1972, which you can find a video of this episode in source number 12 of the historical sources document. This historical source is a photo of long-term Inner West resident and activist Robin Plaister resisting arrest at Sydney's first ever Mardi Gras in 1978. You can read more about the history of the Mardi Gras in sources 20 to 28, 32 and 45, and you can also read a lot about Robin Plaister in the historical sources document. There's an interview with her in source number 11, and you can find there the numbers of other sources that are relevant to her activism and campaigning. This historical source is another photograph. I'm using mainly photographs here because they're the easiest sources to include in a PowerPoint presentation. But as I mentioned before, a lot of the historical sources are also recorded oral histories or videos or other types of media. It's not all photographs, but I'm mainly using photographs here in this PowerPoint. So this photograph shows groundbreaking trans rights activist Roberta Perkins in 1983 at the opening of Tiresias House. So Roberta Perkins, through her advocacy but also through her writing as an academic, she campaigned for protections and rights for Sydney's trans community, and she managed to obtain funding for the first ever government-funded refuge for trans people in Petersham on unceded Gadigal and Wangal land, and this photo shows the opening of that refuge. The name of that refuge was eventually changed to the Gender Centre, and the Gender Centre still operates today. You can read more about that in historical source number 34. These historical sources are related to the decriminalisation of male homosexuality in New South Wales, which took place in 1984. The above photo shows two activists, Robert French and Lex Watson, who was a long-term Inner West resident, signing public declarations saying that they were homosexuals in 1983. At a time when male homosexuality was still illegal. And this campaign, along with many others, eventually led to the decriminalisation of male homosexuality in 1984. You can read more about this milestone event in sources 35 and 36. In the historical sources document, you can read about a number of LGBTQ plus clubs and social organisations that emerged in the Inner West in the 1980s and 1990s. One notable example is the Flying Bats Football Club, which was established in 1985 and is still running today. And another notable example is the Dykes on Bikes Motorcycle Club, which formed in 1988 and is also still running today. You can read about both of these clubs in sources 40 and 41, as well as many others in that document. The decades of the 2000s and 2010s saw the emergence of a new wave of LGBTQ plus collectives, artists, performers and venues in and around the Inner West on unceded Gadigal and Wangal land that created platforms for trans people and people of colour. So some examples which you can read about in the historical sources document include the Red Rattler Theatre, the Glitter Militia Collective, which put on Monster Gras events, and the House of Slay, who are pictured in this photograph here, who are a ballroom house led by trans women of colour, including house mother Benji Ra. You can read more about these collectives and artists, venues, and performers in sources 47, 53, and 55. This photograph shows Peter de Waal and Peter Bonsall-Boone campaigning for marriage equality before the postal vote in 2017. And this couple, they were both very prominent activists. We saw them in another source. They were the couple that were the first two men to kiss on Australian television. And you can read about them in many of the historical sources. They pop up in a lot of them because they were very active activists throughout many decades in the Inner West. And you can also read more about marriage equality in sources 50 and 51. Finally, this is a photograph of the Inner West Pride Centre, which opened in 2024 in what used to be the Newtown Town Hall. The organisation that won the bid to lead and manage the Pride Centre is 2010. They're an organisation that began in the early 1980s, and they have for many decades offered housing services and support services for LGBTQ plus young people in New South Wales. They also merged with the Gay and Lesbian Counselling Service New South Wales in 2012, which was a phone line started by Camp Inc. in Balmain in the early 1970s, a kind of helpline for LGBTQ plus people. So a lot of rich history in that organisation and also in this Pride Centre, which has recently opened. Those are just a few examples of some of the historical sources that you can find in the Historical Sources document. But there are many more. There's 57 in total. And as I mentioned previously, some of those are recorded oral histories, some are videos, some are websites or text-based sources. So there's a lot of different content and resources in that document. So after you introduce the site study to your students via the PowerPoint presentation that is part of this site study kit, you can start working through the guided historical inquiry document with students, which follows the process of historical inquiry outlined in the new version of the Stage 5 History Syllabus, but it's also relevant to the old version of the syllabus. So, as I already discussed, those activities are designed to be a sort of step-by-step process of how to conduct a mini historical inquiry, or if you want to expand it out, it could be a bigger historical inquiry. And some of those activities include skimming activities to start with, sorting the historical sources into themes, such as First Nations LGBTQ plus activists or LGBTQ plus law reform, or the students can write their own theme that they would like to focus on within this broader topic of LGBTQ plus history in the Inner West and have their theme approved by the teacher. The idea here is to give the students a lot of agency and flexibility in regards to how they want to conduct their historical inquiry. So they're going to be writing their own inquiry questions that will guide their research and investigation, and they're also going to choose how they would like to present their findings to their class or their teacher or peers. And this aligns with the steps that are outlined in the history syllabus. The idea here really is to give the students a lot of agency. That is part of the process of historical inquiry. So it's good practice for them to do that. And to complete these activities, the students are going to need to refer to the historical sources document. They go together, so the students will be working between those two documents. And if you or your students would like to do any further research, you could refer to the extended bibliography of library holdings. That document is a list of all of the relevant items in the Inner West Library's collection that relate to LGBTQ plus history from the Inner West on unceded Gadigal and Wongal land. And so that is an introduction to the content of this site study. There's a lot of material here. You may want to just do part of it. If you are limited for time, you may want to do just a couple of activities from the guided historical inquiry document. You don't have to do the whole thing, but we have included enough information here that you can do a complete historical inquiry with your students as part of this site study if you have time. And like I mentioned before, you could even expand this site study out as a school developed depth study, which is part of the Stage 5 syllabus if you choose to. I really hope that you enjoy working on this site study with your students. For me, it's been such a pleasure to have the opportunity to research the LGBTQ plus history of this area, and hopefully it's going to inspire your students to become interested in local history or interested in LGBTQ plus history if that's an area of interest for them. And it's going to give them an opportunity to practice historical skills, historical concepts, and the process of historical inquiry that we've talked about within this presentation. So good luck, and I hope you enjoy, and thank you for listening.